Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today, as always. I'm Amber Duke, back at the desk with Niall Stanage. Niall, good morning.
Good morning, Amber. Great to see you. Glad to have you back with us after a little break.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
I'm glad to hear it. Everything good with you?
Everything's going well. What are in your notes this morning, Niall?
Well, Amber, I think we will probably have a disagreement on this one, but here we go anyway. We might not expect a lowly graduate student and a big Washington law firm to have much in common. But we don't live in ordinary times. The link is, in fact, clear. President Trump has targeted both the student and the law firm. They're part of his assault on civil liberties and his assault on dissent. Call it the Big Chill, an attempt at government suppression that has truly ominous ramifications. The first case, of course, concerns Mahmoud Khalil. He's the 30-year-old green card holder due to officially graduate from Columbia University in May, who the Trump administration is trying to throw out of the country. Khalil was born to exiled Palestinian parents in Syria and has helped lead campus protests against the brutal Israeli assault on Gaza. Khalil lives in New York with his wife, an American citizen who is 8 months pregnant. 6 days ago, as the couple returned home from dinner at a friend's house, Mahmoud was arrested by agents of the Department of Homeland Security. He is currently being held not in New York or anywhere near it, but in Louisiana. Now, even people who are not especially passionate about the Palestinian cause can see the bigger dangers in his case. Put simply, Khalil is being deprived of liberty without standing accused of any crime. Instead, the complaints against him are ridiculously vague. One supposed justification is that he led activities, quote, aligned with Hamas. What does this mean? Is he accused of being in contact with the radical group or taking direction from them? No. The administration wants to deport him because his presence or activities have, quote, potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences for the United States. Seriously? The awesome power of the United States government, backed by a military that gets $800 billion a year, are threatened by a guy handing out leaflets on campus. Back in the real world, it's pretty clear that Mahmoud Khalil is being punished for expressing opinions that the Trump administration doesn't like. And the people in government who have defended his arrest have all but confirmed that suspicion. Here's Troy Edgar, the Deputy Secretary at the DHS, on NPR's Morning Edition with Michelle Martin.
He's a legal permanent resident. I have to keep insisting on it. He is a legal permanent resident. So what is the standard? Is any criticism of the Israeli government a deportable offense?
Like I said, I think that at this point, when he was entered into the country on a student visa, at any point we can go through and evaluate what his status is, and the Secretary of State
is any criticism of the United States government a deportable offense?
Like I said, if you go through the process and you're a student and you're here on a visa and you go through at any point,
is any criticism of the government a deportable offense?
It's like I said, as a student, he comes to the United States on a student visa, applies. Well, let me put it this way, Michelle. Imagine if he came in and filled out the form and said, I want a student visa. They asked him, what are you going to do here? And he's like,
he was a student.
Now to the other case, one in which the president is seeking to intimidate law firms away from working for his opponents. The target here is the Washington firm of Perkins Coie. In an executive order issued on March 6th, Trump demanded a range of punishments against them. He wants security clearances stripped from anyone working for the firm. He wants any government contracts terminated. And he wants federal agencies to draw up lists of any contracts, quote, with entities that do business with Perkins Coie. To be real, Trump is trying to put the firm out of business. His beef with Perkins Coie goes back to the 2016 election. The firm represented Hillary Clinton that year. It employed Fusion GPS to dig up opposition research on then candidate Trump, and Fusion in turn hired former British intelligence officer Michael Steele, author of the infamous Steele dossier. But here's the thing. There's nothing illegal about what the law firm did. Don't just take my word for it. In 2022, Trump sued in a private capacity, accusing Perkins Coie, among others, with illegality related to the Clinton campaign. His case was dismissed. But make no mistake, this case is no more just about Perkins Coie than the Mahmoud Khalil case is just about Khalil. This is about trying to browbeat legal firms out of representing interests that Trump opposes. It's about making it too expensive, too cumbersome, too much of a hassle to go against him. And of course, there's more. More efforts to suppress dissent, like a February 18th order that banned any executive branch employee from expressing disagreement with the president, quote, on a matter of law. There are more efforts to intimidate the legal world, like Elon Musk's call to impeach judges. And more efforts to curb the media, like the petty punishment of the Associated Press over language and the spurious suing of CBS for $20 billion no less over a Kamala Harris interview. Trump's supporters will support him here too, of course. But for the rest of America, democracy itself has been hollowed out and poisoned from within.
All right, so where do you want to start? Should we start with Mahmoud Khalil?
Well, why not?
Okay, so I would push back, obviously, on the claims that his revocation or potential revocation of his green card is about speech. I think it's about actions. He was directly involved in the illegal encampments on Columbia University's campus and was also the ringleader of the group that encouraged people to take over private property through the invasion of the campus buildings.
Go ahead. I'll come back to this, but go ahead.
Absolutely. And endorsing terrorism, like his support of Hamas's actions on October 7th, has been a legal reason to get rid of either permanent status or a student visa since 1952. This is very clearly in the law. Mahmoud Khalil is welcome to challenge the government's actions, in which case the government will have to prove by clear and convincing evidence that he engaged in actions that violate the terrorism clause related to immigration visas. But there's no requirement that he has to be charged with a crime or convicted prior to the government trying to revoke that.
So a couple of things. In relation to whether or not he is a ringleader of illegal encampments is one thing and the occupation of buildings is another. If he has done something illegal in that respect, the appropriate venue for him to be prosecuted for that illegality is the criminal courts. In relation to the quote-unquote support of terrorism, that is not what the government is alleging. They are alleging that his presence is injurious to American foreign policy. That is normally a clause that is utilised and only very rarely utilised for senior government officials from foreign governments or from people playing a leading political role that is has some kind of geopolitical significance. This guy is a student of Palestinian heritage who's protesting policies that he doesn't like. And that seems to me very troublesome that is perceived to reach the level that he should be kicked out of the country.
I do agree in a sense that the government is walking into a thorny issue because they do have to provide, I think, clear evidence and support and justification for the reasons why they're planning to revoke his green card. But I don't buy the argument that he has to necessarily be tried and convicted in a criminal court in order for this to be removed. Again, the proper procedure for revocation of a green card is that the government makes its claim. Because he has due process, he gets to appeal that claim, and then the government has to prove via clear and convincing evidence that he actually engaged in the actions that violate the terms of his green card.
Right. We're going to run out of time, I know, and I'm sure you have things to say about Perkins Coie too. So since I took up some time with my notes, you go for it with the counter-argument.
Well, thank you. Yeah, on Perkins Coie, I mean, I hear your point that they weren't charged with doing anything illegal. But I would think that if a group of lawyers employ someone who creates an unverified dossier, they don't verify any of the information themselves, and then pass off these salacious allegations to the FBI to foment an investigation into the presidential candidate's campaign, as well as spying on members of his campaign, then I don't want those people to be getting government contracts or to be able to have security clearances because they've shown that they can't use them responsibly. And Susterman, who was one of the attorneys at Perkins Coie, was acquitted of this, but convicted of lying to the FBI about whether or not he was representing any clients when he met with members of the FBI to allege that Trump had ties to a Russian-backed bank, Alpha Bank, which turned out to be a totally false and salacious allegation. So these people were basically using their panache as lawyers, their security clearances, as a way of taking advantage of people who would believe that they were telling the truth in order to take out an opponent of someone that they were representing. And I think that's completely irresponsible.
So firstly, on a point of fact, I don't often do this, but if our people in the control room can check, because the arguments you make are valid, I don't think that Michael Sussman was convicted. I think
No,
he
I
was
said
acquitted.
he was acquitted. I think I did say acquitted.
I thought you said he was convicted of lying to the FBI, and I think he was acquitted.
I said accused and acquitted.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, fair enough. In relation to the broader point then, I think that the argument is, firstly, Perkins Coie did not directly employ Michael Steele for a start. That they employed Fusion GPS, who employed Michael Steele. The question then is whether that should ban them from any government contracts ever again. I don't think it should, because I think it is at one remove from them for a start. I also think, and this was what I was really trying to get at in the broader argument, this belief that, or this order actually from President Trump, that people who do business with that law firm should be listed and investigated, seems to me plainly an attempt to chill the overall climate and discourage law firms from going against Trump, because then not only they, but their clients can face some kind of potential sanction.
I would view it as discouraging lawfare, which is not just going against Trump, but actually, again, using unverified false claims in order to try to take out, not only take out a presidential candidate who is running against their client, but also to potentially put him in prison. And I think this is a violation of how an ethical lawyer should behave. And so I don't want my taxpayer dollars or other people's taxpayer dollars helping to prop up a firm that exists solely to try to take out political opponents.
Well, I mean, Perkins Coie has like 1,200 attorneys and I think double that amount of support staff. I think it's very simplistic to say they exist to take out political opponents.
Okay, fair enough. Next up, are Russia and Ukraine close to a ceasefire? We'll discuss. Will the Russia-Ukraine war stop anytime soon? Well, Ukraine and the U.S. recently agreed to a 30-day ceasefire proposal.
But is Russia on board? Here's Russian President Vladimir Putin yesterday.
We agree with the propositions to stop hostilities, but we proceed from the fact that such ceasefire should be such that would lead to a permanent peace and remove the original causes of the crisis.
The New York Times is reporting that Special Envoy Steve Witkoff met with Putin last night. The Kremlin told the Times that Putin expects to speak to Trump himself sometime in the near future.
Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that feeling, quote, cautious optimism was reasonable. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz echoed this sentiment on Fox News. The last time Trump and Putin spoke was on February 12th.
Putin did lay out numerous conditions for the ceasefire, though. He stressed that the peace deal must address the so-called root causes of the war. For one, he does not want foreign troops on Ukrainian soil.
He also said that Russia would have to surrender or die in the Russian city of Kursk, which Ukraine had controlled for a short period. Putin suggested he'd need questions answered about Western aid to Ukraine. He's apparently vexed about the idea that Ukraine could rearm during this potential 30-day ceasefire.
As far as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, he said in an address to his country that Putin's response was very predictable. Putin set so many preconditions, Zelensky said, that nothing will work out at all, or that it will not work out for as long as possible.
Author Richard Hanania wrote on X, Putin rejects the ceasefire. We've gained clarity. Putin does not want peace and is not looking for a way out. It's now the Trump administration's move, and it has no good reason to hold back support for Ukraine.
Chief political analyst for Fox News, Britt Hume, wrote, if Putin rejects the Trump ceasefire proposal, we will then find out what, if anything, Mr. Trump has in store to punish Russia. I'm not prepared to believe the president will sell out Ukraine to end the war, but if Putin refuses to accept the ceasefire and come to the table, we'll find out soon enough.
So this is an interesting one, Amber. I mean, I'm not sure it breaks down completely on partisan lines. I am skeptical of Vladimir Putin, as I think everyone should be. I note that he has imposed fairly stringent conditions on this sort of these good vibes about a ceasefire, talking about the Western aid issue that we mentioned and so forth. It seems to me that even though there is this push to create a sense of optimism, we're still some way from resolving this. But where do you see it?
Yeah, I sit about in the same spot. I mean, look, I think it's obviously a positive development that we're even discussing the idea of a ceasefire. I think this would have been unimaginable even a year ago. So the fact that it's on the table seemingly is great news. At the same time, obviously, there's going to be a lot of negotiating left to do, a lot of moving parts to this, and both Russia and Ukraine have kind of dug in their heels pretty aggressively to this point, where even with U.S. involvement, it's going to be hard to find an arrangement that satisfies both of them. I mean, the reality is they're both going to have to make major concessions in order for this to work properly.
I take that point that there will have to be compromises to reach a deal. Where I have some dissent from the idea about they're both sticking in their heels is that Russia is sitting in about 1/5 of Ukraine's territory. Like, it is an occupying army. And so is it sticking in your heels to say, if you're Ukrainian, no, that shouldn't happen, we'll have to get them out of there? That it seems unfair to characterize that to me as sticking in your heels. Now, there is obviously a question about, is it realistic to remove Russia from all of that territory? How long would it take? What kind of aid would be needed? Do the Europeans step up if the US steps back and all of that? But the idea that it's sort of two sides that are both being equally obstructionist here, I just don't agree with that.
I would say that the digging in the heels is less about the complaints over the territory, which I think are legitimate, but again, to your point, not realistic, I think, for Ukraine to expect that Russia is just going to vacate and they're going to be able to force them out if they don't. I think the digging in the heels is more about their really aggressive push for future U.S. security guarantees. And we saw this during the meeting between Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office. There was a deal that was on the table for the U.S. to get a portion of Ukrainian minerals, and Zelensky decided that he was going to basically renegotiate the deal in the Oval Office by starting to talk about future security guarantees, which were not part of this particular arrangement that had been negotiated by Steve Witkoff prior to Zelensky coming to the Oval Office. And if you talk to members of the administration, they say, yeah, every time we call the Ukrainians and we talk about this deal, they always want to fast forward to security guarantees. That's not something that the U.S. is willing to entertain until they're under the impression that Ukraine is actually interested in a lasting peace deal. And so it seems like they keep getting out ahead over their skis because they want to make sure that the money keeps flowing in.
Let me stick up for the Ukrainian position a bit then on that score. It is true that the mineral deal contains, as you said, no security guarantees from the US. The question is that a good thing or not? And I would argue that it is not, because the Ukrainians have had the experience previously with Vladimir Putin of coming to agreements, perhaps not backed by the US, but backed by the Europeans, that Putin has then circumvented or broken. And they understandably say, if we are going to have to give the kind of compromises that you're talking about, give up some of our national territory to end this war, we can't then give up a parcel of land this time around and have Putin come back and invade us again in 3 years' time. Any ceasefire agreement, any lasting ceasefire agreement, has to be underwritten in a way that makes it credible. And it is, to my mind, entirely plausible for the Ukrainians to say, how are we going to make it credible given Putin's past record? Is the US going to say, we will stand with you? If the answer to that is no, then who is going to stand with us? Those all seem perfectly legitimate questions.
Of course, they are legitimate questions. The problem that I have is that they agreed to the minerals deal by all accounts, and Zelensky was pushing for coming to the White House, talking with Trump in person, doing this bilateral meeting, having their joint press conference. They were supposed to sign the deal that day, and he decided to renegotiate in front of the American press. I mean, this is interesting. I knew we'd eventually arrive at a place of partisan difference in this. I think that he was essentially set up by Vance and Trump, and that he was goaded, and whether he should have taken the goading or not is a different matter. But it was Vance who raised the argument that we have to think about diplomacy here, and Zelensky made the very fair counter-argument that we have tried diplomacy before,
Putin has violated the terms that were agreed upon, so we can't just rely on words alone without some level of security guarantee.
It started way before that, though. Watching the full press conference between these two, this was, 45 minutes long? And if you watch Zelensky during the entire beginning portion of that, he's sitting with his arms crossed. He's frequently interrupting the vice president, the president. He's behaving like a child, frankly.
Oh, Amber.
No, he is. And then he, in response to the vice president talking about diplomacy, he refers to him by JD. He says, "What diplomacy are you talking about, JD?" And that's where it goes off the rails because of the disrespect that he showed to his American counterparts after we've given them hundreds of billions of dollars. I think JD is right to ask for a little bit of gratitude.
I think that we see those things through different lenses, but that's okay. We can live with that. Coming up next, we have lots more to talk about on Rising, so stick with us.
What's in a word? Specifically, these words: minority, black, disability, oppression, stereotype, prejudice, and women.
Well, these are among scores of seemingly innocuous words that have been scrubbed from the government lexicon. That's right, the government is at war with these words. According to the New York Times, reams of past memos have been scrubbed of words that reflect a moment that was and a moment that is. Here's an example or two. Notice the words that were deleted here. The last year has brought significant challenges to the Head Start workforce. All staff have been impacted by COVID-19. As such, OHS is committed to a culture of wellness that includes holistic support for the entire Head Start workforce. There was also this. The negotiations team represents the United States in negotiations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Of course, as well as all that, DEI is the equivalent of a curse word. Let's watch.
I will also end the government policy of trying to socially engineer race and gender into every aspect of public and private life. We will forge a society that is colorblind and merit-based.
The federal government has whitewashed the terms being used. What's more, entire websites have vanished, including those covering public health data and some with climate-related information. While there are groups trying to archive that data and those websites, some will obviously fall through the cracks. And last but not least is USAID.
Per a report in Politico, remaining staff were ordered on Tuesday to destroy documents. The document purge raised questions about whether any of the materials should be archived or otherwise retained for legal and historical reasons. Anna Kelly, a spokesperson for the White House, downplayed concerns in a social media post late Tuesday. Quote, "This was sent to roughly 36 employees. The documents involved were old, mostly courtesy content, and the originals still exist on classified computer systems. More fake news hysteria."
So I'm assuming you think it is fake news hysteria, broadly speaking, Amber?
I just don't see what the big deal is, I guess.
So I think I think I might not disagree with you quite as emphatically as you think, but tell me what you think and then we'll go from there.
It just seems pretty standard that new administrations remove materials from past administrations that is not in keeping with how they want to run the government. Biden did this several times during his administration. One of the first things he did when he entered office was to scrub the 1776 report that a Trump commission had created to basically counter the 1619 project. He got rid of official documents relating to Afghan security training and weapons funding from 2001 up to the time that he took office. So this is not out of the norm, and I think the idea that they're trying to turn this into a massive scandal when we're just talking about a website seems a bit bizarre to me.
So here's where I will offend everyone by not really fully endorsing that and not really fully disagreeing with it either. This, I think, is a bit more nuanced than people are portraying it as. There's, of course, a rather limited market for nuance at the moment. But
we like it on this show.
We do like it on this show. And to that point, here's where I agree with you. There is, I think, a danger in throwing all of this into one bucket and saying it is deleting information, deleting important data. One of the pieces that I was looking at that was part of this story was actually from NPR, and they noted that as they termed this purging websites to do with LGBTQ interests. And one of the pages they alluded to was an HHS page that in the Biden era said that HHS stands with transgender and gender non-conforming youth in unequivocally stating that gender-affirming care for minors improves their physical and mental health. Whether I like it or not, the Trump administration does not believe that. The Trump-era HHS obviously does not stand unequivocally behind that, and that's okay to change. Where I differ, I think, from you or from the people who say, well, it's no big deal, is not in the construction of policy, but the destruction of existing research or data, which does seem weirder. There's, for example, apparently a digital tool that showed unequal or disproportionate areas affected by pollution that has disappeared. There was a January the 6th searchable database maintained by the Department of Justice that has disappeared. There was an IRS form where private schools had to certify that they hadn't engaged in racial discrimination that has disappeared. Those things to me seem not about a new administration changing policy and enunciating its policy, but in removing or hiding or concealing knowledge, concealing facts.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, what's happened in some of these cases is that the Doge employees were basically given keywords to search of things to remove, and they made mistakes along the way. One of the examples of this was at the Enola Gay case, where they had removed a page involving that individual because it had the word gay in it. And so they were just basically taking everything down. And a lot of the websites have since been restored because they realized that they were caught up in errors of people not being judicious enough with what actually they were removing. And there's going to be mistakes made in these large efforts to basically reshape the way that the federal government works. We've seen that with some of the employees who have been fired and then rehired related to the bird flu. I think we talked about that a few weeks ago. And I'm willing to give some latitude to the administration because I think that the efforts that they're undertaking are incredibly massive, where an error here or there on a web page being removed that shouldn't have been removed doesn't seem like, again, a major scandal to me as long as it's rectified.
So here's what I would say, I think, in counter to that to some extent. In relation to both Doge writ large and to this issue in particular, I think the onus is on the government, whoever happens to be in power at that time, to be judicious and to be well-reasoned and to be careful. And one of the difficulties, I think, with the current administration is it is prone to these very blanket assertions. And not only in relation to the Enola Gay matter, which was, I think, literally to do with the word gay. There was another separate thing where the Air Force briefly removed or thought it had to remove a lesson or a part of a lesson about the Tuskegee Airmen. And then a day or two later, it was decided that, in fact, they didn't have to do that. But that, to me, gets to this thing where we can't acknowledge, the argument being made by the Trump administration is a very sweeping pushback against anything that acknowledges past racial inequity. And even the Trump administration or the people who enact those laws eventually come to the conclusion that, okay, well, actually, we don't really want to suppress mention of the Tuskegee Airmen. And so that sort of stuff gets kind of confused.
I'm also curious about how many of these stories are the result of malicious compliance. Are there staffers who are taking these Doge directives and instead of complying with the spirit of the directive, intentionally taking away things that could technically be classified under removing references to race, but doing it in a way that intentionally makes the administration look like they are using a chainsaw instead of a scalpel? And
Mr. Musk's favorite weapon, however, is the chainsaw.
That's right. So I would be curious to know if some of these employees are in fact engaging in malicious compliance and saying, well, look, you gave us this order, this is what it's going to do, it's going to get rid of Enola Gay and the Tuskegee Airmen. We warned you, and sort of putting them on defense in that way. And then how many are cases of people not paying attention and going too far?
Sure, or the rules going too far. Well, in any event, we'll move on to whether NPR tried to put one of its hosts back in the so-called closet. That's coming up next on Rising. National Public Radio has stumbled into some national public drama, and it all stemmed from an email.
Semaphore reported Wednesday that NPR's managing editor for Standards and Practices, Tony Caven, told longtime host Ari Shapiro that he could not attend a corporate LGBT pride event. The email reads, "The guidance in our ethics handbook is to avoid appearances at private industry or corporate functions." And apparently, Caven accidentally sent the email to a bunch of other NPR journalists.
Caven then ended his email by telling Shapiro that it was best for him to decline the offer. Shapiro, who hosts All Things Considered, responded, "Every year I've spoken at corporate pride events and you've personally signed off on them. It has never been an issue before." He said, "I'm curious what's changed." Semaphore then writes that Shapiro also noted that Caven had mistakenly replied to Newsdesk and international editors, so the message went to pretty much everyone in the newsroom. Hate when that happens. It turns out NPR decided to let Shapiro attend the event after all. A spokesperson told Semaphore that the outlet made the decision after the original email thread.
Republicans have been cracking down on funding for federal media outlets like NPR and PBS. Senator John Kennedy introduced a bill late last year called the No Propaganda Act. He said that public news outlets are too partisan and biased and therefore don't deserve taxpayer funds. The Trump administration has also cracked down on diversity, equity, and inclusion policies across both the public and private sectors. Pam Bondi, Trump's attorney general, has vowed to investigate companies that implement DEI.
After NPR's chief DEI officer stepped down, CEO Catherine Maher told Semaphore that that department was done.
FCC Chair Brendan Carr said he was investigating NPR and PBS to see whether they've aired illegal commercials. If this is the case, Carr says their federal funding could be pooled. NPR gets around 1% of its funding from the government, while PBS gets around 16%.
So, on one hand, whether Ari Shapiro attends a corporate pride event or not is, I admit, not a matter of enormous national import. That being said, I think what is of some national import is this idea that broadcasters that in this case receive, well, in NPR's case, a pretty small share of their funding from the federal government, appear to be running scared of running afoul of the administration. And I think if that attitude is percolating down to the point where people get nervous about a well-known anchor who, by his own statements, has attended these kind of events before, not attending them, that seems disquieting and just generally speaking not the direction in which I think we should be going as a country.
I think the easy solution is that since it's only 1% of their budget anyway, just take the funding away, they'll be fine, and then they can do whatever they want. It seems pretty easy.
It is weird that it is. I did not realize, in fact, that the NPR budget was, that federal funding comprised such a small amount of it. And that, I mean, I know you're being at least somewhat flippant, but if you're dependent on the 1%, like surely they could raise the 1% by some different means. It does seem different to me than PBS, which is 16%, right. I think we said. And, 16% of a budget is a significant share. We could also get into the whole other tangled debate about Voice of America, which is in fact an entirely government-funded outlet in which President Trump is now trying to place Carrie Lake at its head. But on the NPR 1% point, that is just fundamentally weird to me. I notice, incidentally, relatedly, that some local NPR stations are trying to sort of distance themselves from the national brand in South Carolina and Texas. We've seen that in particular. That's, I assume, a responsiveness to the different political and cultural environments in, say, those states as opposed to New York or LA or Washington, D.C. for that matter. But yeah, the 1% point is interesting.
Yeah, they seem really attached to that 1% for some reason.
Very important to them.
Yeah, very important to them. Must be funding their computers or something.
Maybe so.
Look, it's no secret, I think, that these outlets can be incredibly biased. Uri Berliner went super viral for writing this free press post about leaving NPR and a lot of the liberal bias that he seemingly encountered there, including their desire to not report on the origins of the COVID-19 virus as coming from the Wuhan lab, refusing to report on the Hunter Biden laptop story because, quote, "We don't want to waste our time on stories that are not really stories, and we don't want to waste the listeners' and readers' time on stories that are just pure distractions." So for NPR and PBS, fund Sesame Street. That's great. Have fun. But if you are funding a news outlet that is making these editorial decisions that are deliberately ignoring stories that are inconvenient to a particular political administration, then that's incredibly problematic. Taxpayer dollars, I don't think, should go to those people.
I think that the NPR issue on the Hunter Biden laptop is obviously not a defensible position. I think that there is a broader context when it comes to the current administration, because we have seen the current president lambaste the media in ways that I often consider very unfair. I mean, we mentioned earlier on this whole shenanigans that are going on with AP about the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America, or the suit against Paramount, the parent company of CBS, which I consider just completely sort of vexatious and pointless. But in relation to those claims, or those, I shouldn't say claims, in fact, those elements of coverage, I would not defend those. Although I sit on this side of the desk, I'm not a huge NPR fan, because I find it, I'll offend half the people in our control room now, but I find it actually very smug. It's less my objection to what I consider its political leaning as the fact that it seems so delighted with itself for having those leanings that makes it difficult, in my view, to listen to. But just broadening it out slightly, Amber, beyond the media component, do you not think it is kind of weird that bosses are now on sort of hyper alert for people doing things like attending a Pride event, which obviously was not a problem before and plainly is a problem? Do you not have any disquiet about that becoming such a sort of contentious topic?
I suppose the question would go to motivation then, because we don't know if this was legitimately them worried about losing federal funding, or perhaps the standards editor just hadn't noticed in the past that Ari Shapiro was attending these events. I have no way of knowing that. It sounds like it is a violation of their policy, but basically they've been giving him a pass. So should he continue to get a pass just because they did it in years prior?
I mean, I think I'm less inclined than you are to believe that it was just a coincidence and they suddenly read the guidebook this year, the first year of the Trump administration, having failed to do so in previous years. But who knows? Perhaps our sources in NPR can tell us. Probably not, after we have criticized them from both sides during this segment. In any event, we have a lot more to talk about on Rising right after this. Veteran attorney Mark Zaid has spent decades defending government whistleblowers and spies, but now he's defending himself from President Trump's crosshairs. Mark was at a wedding in February when he discovered his security clearance was pulled. Attorney General Pam Bondi posted the news on X. Mark Zaid was never formally informed. Zaid landed on Trump's radar in 2019 when he represented the whistleblower who exposed Trump for pressing Ukrainian President Zelensky for dirt on Joe Biden. This in turn led to Trump's first impeachment. Mark is among several other people in the legal and national security world who Trump appears to be targeting. Last Thursday, the president signed an executive order directing federal agencies to terminate contracts with Perkins Coie, the law firm that represented Hillary Clinton during her 2016 presidential run.
A federal judge swooped in Wednesday to temporarily block Trump's order against Perkins Coie. Joining us now to discuss further is Mark Zaid. He's a national security attorney and co-founder of Whistleblower Aid, a nonprofit legal organization that helps public and private sector workers report and expose wrongdoing. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Good morning to you both.
So let's start with your reaction to getting your security clearance revoked. You have alleged that this is basically a political persecution and have described it as a red badge of courage. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, it was something, frankly, that I expected, because I had no illusions that this second Trump administration was going to be anything other than vindictive, retaliatory, and petty. So, I mean, I have spent 30 plus years going after the U.S. government. Doesn't make a difference to me who's in the White House. I will represent whistleblowers and others who are suing that administration. It seems that the Trump administration and those around him have the thinnest of the skin, so that this is a big issue. So, ironically, I did not even have classified access during the whistleblower case for the first impeachment. I did the following year have my access increased by the Trump administration to the highest level of security clearances of a top secret SCI, TSSCI, as we say it. So I was frankly expecting this. In fact, I ended my statement when I learned that Trump had taken this action, which was through the New York Post of all places. I ended my statement with saying, "What took you so long?"
Mark, two questions which are related to one another in a way. Although you were expecting this, to what extent does this action impede your capacity to do your job? And then broadening out from that, do these kind of actions have a chilling effect on the profession at large, even though I would assume you're probably pretty defiant about it?
Yeah, so I'll start with that first. To me, it goes to that red badge of courage. I'm just emboldened to fight more. I'm like, bring it, that type of attitude. But does it have a chilling effect? Oh, you better bet it does. I'm used to being targeted by governments. Targeted with like a little t. I mean, I sued the government of Libya, a terrorist state, for decades. Nothing happened. I sue the CIA all the time. I don't expect anything to be done actually to me. But this is something different. But other lawyers are incredibly chilled. There's been lots of stories about how many of the big law firms have been hesitant to join in the fight in representing federal employees like I am to challenge the administration for fear of what it might do to their client base. Hey, it's my law firm. I can do what I want, so I'm not impacted by it. Now, am I impacted? Yeah, sure. Is it going to cause my practice to be incredibly different? At the end of the day, I'm an employment lawyer, but I'm an employment lawyer for spies, American spies, people at the CIA, the NSA, the FBI. So there are certain cases I will not be able to handle because I will not have access to classified information. The harm is really not to me, it's to the federal employees who now can't utilize frankly, one of the more experienced lawyers just because I'm the one who's been doing it for all these years. And they'll go to someone who's less experienced and maybe will make a mistake, and national security will suffer as a result. But the Perkins Coie case, Trump went further than what he has done to me. That executive order, by which I'm insulted that I got no executive order. I got a New York Post article and a tweet. I think I should have an executive order. So President Trump, I would like something to frame on my wall, please. But that executive order went much further. It targeted the firm entirely, even though the lawyers that they were really desiring to hit had left the firm years ago. This firm has like 1,000+ lawyers around the country or world, and it included all of them, even outside of Washington, D.C., and it banned them from federal buildings to include federal courts, right? As a lawyer, how do you go to federal court if you're banned from the building? And it was impacting and targeting their clients, so that if a client had Perkins Coie as their lawyer, that client's contract with the U.S. government would have to be turned down, destroyed, revoked. That was why the court was so steadfast and strong in shutting down parts of the executive order, which I will end with saying did not address the security clearance angles of the executive order, because that's a much more complicated issue to deal with.
Can you share some of the whistleblower cases that you took on during the last administration to hold Biden to account?
Yeah, in fact, at one point, it's been publicly reported that I was the initial whistleblower lawyer for one of the IRS whistleblowers who has made so much news about Hunter Biden. I was the one, as was reported, to start that process and bring that individual to Congress, which then it was taken over by another organization and I guess still continues. Oftentimes a lot of the whistleblower cases, they have nothing to do with the administration at issue. I mean, this was the first time in 2019 where I had a whistleblower case where the president of the United States was involved. It's usually inside the agencies. So, we had numerous whistleblowers inside different agencies who they're complaining about how their bosses are doing things, right? It's career people. It's not a political issue. So I point out that what I do is hold administrations accountable for ethical and illegality, violations of ethics and law. And I can't help it, not my fault, if the Trump administration tends to have more than other administrations. But I could care less about the politics of it, which is why I was willing to go after the Biden family too.
Yeah, in regards to the Biden family, I think one of the sticking points, I assume, for this administration is your representation of some of the signers of the Hunter Biden laptop letter. And you've said that you believe that there was nothing in the letter that's wrong because your clients naturally use some weaselly language to get around the fact that they were calling the Hunter Biden laptop Russian disinformation by using phrases like, well, it has all the hallmarks of it, and in our opinion, if we are right. But realistically, we know what that letter was doing. And your clients, I would argue, use their security clearances to their advantage to try to influence an election by putting out this false statement about Russian disinformation. So do you think that that had something to do with your security clearance being revoked?
I don't know if it had, it's hard to say, right? I don't know. That's not what the explanation was that at least has been publicly stated. So I represent 8 of the 51 who signed. These were individuals who were all out of government. You know, they're entitled to exercising their First Amendment rights like anybody else. And okay, sure, they're basing it on their experiences from within the community, the intelligence community. Well, I mean, you'll have to shut down Washington and many journalists nowadays who are at outlets who used to work in a presidential administration and had a security clearance. There's a line that any of us, or none of us, I should say, should cross, which is into classified information. But, the notion of what constitutes Russian disinformation, that's an obvious one. That's been in the public domain for many years. We know the Russians try to influence our elections. We know they're manipulating the databases and online, and they're trying to stoke fires, etc. There was one connection on the letter, not one of my clients, where it was known or asked of the Biden campaign to sort of get this letter, but 50 of the 51 had no knowledge of that. And as I look at the letter, it is a very well-written Washington, D.C. lawyer letter. And it's right, as you say, there are caveats that go both ways. And unfortunately, Politico, which ran the first story, and you guys will understand this as journalists, the headline did not accurately reflect the contents of the letter. So it got blown out of proportion.
We have actually covered that exact point on this show before, Mark, but we're out of time for today. So thanks very much for joining us. Mark Zaid.
Always. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Next, is the top Democrat in the Senate falling in line? Find out why next.
Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is feeling the heat from members of his own party.
Here's Schumer on the Senate floor yesterday.
While the CR bill is very bad, the potential for a shutdown has consequences for America that are much, much worse. For sure, the Republican bill is a terrible option. But I believe allowing Donald Trump to take even much more power via a government shutdown is a far worse option.
Some Democrats weren't happy with Schumer conceding to Republican CR bill. Here's Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
I think there is a deep sense of outrage and betrayal. And this is not just about progressive Democrats. This is across the board, the entire party. There are members of Congress who have won Trump-held districts in some of the most difficult territory in the United States, who walked the plank and took innumerable risks in order to defend the American people, in order to defend Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare, just to see Senate Democrats even consider acquiescing to Elon Musk, I think it is a huge slap in the face, and I think that there's a wide sense of betrayal if things proceed as currently planned. If people think this is a left issue or a right issue, it's not. It's genuinely not. This is about our values and what we stand for, and it's about the right thing and the wrong thing. And we have time to correct course, and I think that's the most urgent message of them all.
One Democrat told CNN that some in the House are going so far as to push Ocasio-Cortez to run against Schumer in a primary. For the CR bill to pass, Republicans will need 60 votes in the Senate, which means they need Democrats. The House passed the 6-month funding bill earlier this week, mostly on party lines.
Other Democrats piled on Schumer, with Congresswoman Bonnie Watson-Coleman writing on X, "Respectfully, Senator Schumer, no. This Republican bill is bad for workers, bad for our veterans, bad for our seniors. Republicans should pull it and let us get back to work crafting a budget that works for all of our families."
Former Biden advisor Susan Rice also piled on, writing in part, "Every Senate Dem should vote no on cloture and no on the CR. No self-respecting Democratic lawmaker who takes his or her responsibility to their constituents and the Constitution seriously can vote for this despicable Trump-Musk power grab CR." I don't think we can say that, but you'll know what the acronym stands for. WTF, Senator Schumer, please grow a spine and quickly.
And Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett wrote, "It is clear that some of us understand the present danger and some don't. I stand by the no vote on the blank check for Trump and Elon. I've got no explanation nor agreement with Senate Dems being complicit in Trump's tyranny." Meanwhile, President Trump wrote in part on Truth Social, "Congratulations to Chuck Schumer for doing the right thing. Took guts and courage. The big tax cuts, LA fire fix, debt ceiling bill, and so much more is coming. We should all work together on that very dangerous situation."
Not mischievous at all by the president there, praising Chuck Schumer and causing him even further trouble with his Democratic Party colleagues. Look, I think that there is a obvious appetite among Democrats for confrontation with the Trump administration. I think anytime a Democratic leader in the Senate, or the House for that matter, assists in passing key Republican legislation, they're going to run into very serious resistance. That is because people on the left of the Democratic Party dislike everything about the Trump agenda and do not wish to see their leaders be complicit in it. I do acknowledge that there's a completely separate tactical argument about what, from the Democratic perspective, is the right thing to do here. And one of the complications is that Trump has scrambled the political picture so much that under, let's say, normal circumstances, a government shutdown might be perilous for both parties in various ways. I don't think Trump would really have any objection to the government shutting down. So the leverage of forcing a government shutdown that Democrats would ordinarily have isn't really there.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm also a little confused as to what precisely they're objecting to. This is a continuing resolution that just extends funding levels from 2024. Ocasio-Cortez and Crockett both voted for effectively the same bill just this past September.
Yeah.
They haven't changed anything besides adding slightly more money for immigration enforcement and for the Pentagon, but everything else is staying exactly the same. It's funding that was passed during the Biden years. So they're making all these claims about Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, which haven't changed at all in this bill.
Well, there is, as I understand the overall makeup of the bill, it is an additional $6 billion for defence and a $13 billion less for non-defence spending. So I think part of their question is, where do those cuts or reductions come from?
Well, they're extending the Trump tax cuts, right, which counts as spending. So I think that's probably the bulk of it.
And the factual, or the as I understand, and I had to delve into this because I wasn't frankly totally clear what their argument was. I think part of their argument is that in just extending government spending, you do not then, as I understand it, appropriate each parcel of money for a specific topic. And by not doing that, they are saying you give greater leeway to President Trump and to people like Musk to withhold funding for things that Democrats consider important.
Right. So basically, when Biden's in charge, we don't care if he has the executive latitude because we agree with his policies, but if Trump has it, then we don't like that because he will do things with the money we don't like.
Well, but I was under the impression that in Biden's case, it is in fact, or was in fact, appropriated for specific purposes. Now, I'm not a congressional expert, but that was my understanding.
Okay, yeah, we'll have to check on that. It seems a little bit hypocritical to me, their objection to this bill. Now, if this bill were the ones where Congress was actually going through and codifying some of the changes that Trump has made in the executive branch, whether cutting certain grant funding, foreign rescissions, those types of things, and this was actually enacting his agenda, so to speak, then I think their objections would be more legitimate. But because it's essentially a continuation, it's like, okay, well, what are you up in arms about? And specifically, again, going back to the claims about Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, even if this is a bill that simply continues past funding, there's no indication that there's going to be any cuts to those programs. Trump wouldn't be able to make cuts to those programs, presumably, under the way that this bill is written. So they seem to be creating this fake boogeyman to try to act like they're standing the line against the Trump administration, but this isn't really the big fight. The big fight's going to be in September after this CR is passed and Congress, Republicans in Congress, start trying to actually enact those cuts that DOJ has identified.
I preface everything when it gets into the weeds of Congress by as I understand it. Social Security and Medicare they are not part of these kind of resolutions because we have mandated that those programs exist and the money is there for them. Now, I think Medicaid funding works differently in that it can be pulled back. I think the broader Democratic argument is about the money not being spent on issues that Democrats would consider serving vulnerable populations. But to get back to my original point about the tactics in all of this, the danger I see from an AOC kind of perspective is if the government shuts down, those services and lots of other services are not delivered. Doesn't that ultimately play into Trump's hands then? If the services aren't being delivered at all, you are either, you run the risk of then proving Elon Musk's point in a sense. And I think that's why Schumer has opted for this rather conciliatory approach as the lesser of two evils. I'm not surprised that it's getting so much resistance, but I do kind of understand what the rationale for it is. I did see a quote from Senator John Hickenlooper, which said, this appealed to my bleak worldview, both choices that we are offered are full of despair, which I think is kind of where the Democrats are right now because of failing to have much congressional power.
Yeah, black pill moment, wow.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure that the shutdown would be that bad for Democrats, if only because mandatory spending does still go out. So people still get Social Security checks, for example, during a government shutdown. Military still works, although unpaid. They get back pay once the government reopens. I think if there's any argument that is compelling against a government shutdown, it's the idea that if there are members of the military under Department of Defense that are conducting operations right now and they're not able to get the support that they need or they're not getting paid for those operations, that's problematic. People don't want to see that. But traditionally, when we've had government shutdowns, they haven't been politically as damaging as one would expect. And then I have not looked at the polling actually on who people would blame more for the shutdown. I think they would blame Democrats more simply because Republicans are the ones that are putting forward the CR. But I think it's a little bit more nuanced than these lawmakers are making out
It's definitely a more complicated story. I do remember years ago Republicans getting some blame for stuff under Obama. But in any event, coming up next, why is a scholar at Yale under the government's crosshairs? Stay with us. Another pro-Palestine voice silenced? That could be the case for Helia Dutegui, who is a Yale scholar and the deputy director of the Law and Political Economy Project. She was placed on leave last week, 3 days after a news site, Jewish Onliner, partly powered by artificial intelligence, accused her of having connections to Samidun, a group the government maintains funds terrorists. Dutegui vehemently denied the claim, telling the New York Times she is not a member of any organization that violates US law. She added that this is part of an ongoing effort to silence scholars. Her attorney, Eric Lee, pushed back too, questioning the validity of Jewish Onliner's reporting given its reliance on AI. Yale said their decision was not based on speech, but rather the serious nature of the allegations.
Yale's decision comes as American universities are on thin ice with the Trump administration. Columbia lost $400 million in federal funding last week for allegedly tolerating anti-Semitism. This week, the administration announced Yale was among 60 schools to face federal cuts if an investigation proves that it allowed anti-Semitic behavior. Joining us now to elaborate on how his client got caught in the middle is Eric Lee, an immigration attorney. Eric, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Hi.
So give us a little bit of background on this case. This Jewish Insider article apparently makes false claims about, or Jewish Onliner article rather, makes false claims about your client. Where did they get this information that she was a part of this group, and what are you doing to set the record straight?
Right. So within the span of a few hours last Wednesday, my client, Dr. Helia Dutegui, was asked to submit herself to an interview with an outside counsel who had been retained. We were given no preparation time. We were not given any protections as to the type of procedures that would be in place during any such an investigation. We had requested a brief religious accommodation so that my client could break her fast from Ramadan, get back to them the very next day. This was denied. She was placed on administrative leave. Her email was cut off. She was banished from campus and erased from Yale's websites. I think the point that you raised earlier, Trump and Yale have the same line. They both say that the massive attacks on democratic rights and anti-war speech are not attacks on speech. Those are simply lies.
In relation to this reporting, we say that Jewish Onliner accused your client of having connections to this group. Now, the group itself, as I understand, is indeed listed by the US government as either supportive of terrorists or whatever. Setting the debate over the group aside, is that complete fiction that your client has any connection to them?
Have you now, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? These are the types of questions that my client isn't obligated to respond to. She's made a very clear statement on Twitter on that. She is not a member of any organization that would constitute a violation of law. I don't know how this AI bot came up with the claim that she's a terrorist. And again, I think that that's the line that's coming from the White House. Mahmoud Khalil was dragged out of his home away from his 8.5-month pregnant wife earlier on the basis of a claim by Marco Rubio that he's a terrorist. So no, I mean, we reject entirely and emphatically this McCarthyite claim that any speech in support of the cause of the people of Palestine and against this government of Israel constitutes terrorism.
But is she or is she not affiliated with that group?
I believe I just answered your question very, very clearly. She's
not
not
really.
a terrorist.
You said,
She's not a member of any.
I'm not a member of any organization that would constitute a violation of U.S. law, but you could easily argue that she was a member of that group, but you don't view that as being a violation of American law.
Well, that's the statement that we have. I think it's perfectly clear. But if you actually talk about the type of association that's being made by Yale and by the Trump administration, it's that participating in a demonstration, and this is coming right from the senior counsel to the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, if they still have the guts to call it that, who said that if you're a citizen and you attend a demonstration, you're a Hamas terrorist, you're going to go to jail for not hours, but years. That's the line coming out of this administration. So I would really encourage you to read Dr. Dutegui's comments on this, which she comments on at length, and I think you'll find the answers to those questions here. Now, as for Jewish Onliner, Haaretz had an exposure just a few weeks ago, which was done by Omer Ben Jacob at Haaretz, which basically acknowledged that the Jewish Onliner is a creation either of the Israeli military or pro-Israeli political forces that make up lies and propaganda to denounce and slander supporters of the Palestinian cause. Yale, in the span of, they sent us an email that said, citing this article, we want to have an investigation. You've got to submit to an interview within 3 hours. This same afternoon, we tried to communicate with them to ask for a little more information. They were not at all interested in learning any of the facts involved in this case. Jewish Onliner, as it turns out, is an AI bot website. The New York Times tried to contact the editors, had to go through many, many layers of bots to even speak to a human being. So the fact that this type of AI is being used now to revoke visas, to facilitate Trump's mass deportation campaign, to facilitate the attack on free speech, and this is an important point to add here. These are not normal times. Donald Trump is trying to establish a dictatorship in this country. In order to accomplish that, he's trying to stifle and suppress opposition. Those who don't agree with the content of pro-Palestinian speech are signing their own arrest warrants by failing to come to the defense of Dr. Dutegui, of Mahmoud Khalil, and others who are similarly situated, being persecuted by the government and the cowards in the university administrations over pro-Palestinian speech.
So, Eric, as you hopefully know, on this show, we're pretty committed to a diversity of opinion, and I, in fact, in an earlier segment today was defending Mr. Khalil from what I consider very unjust treatment. But I think what we're trying to get at really is what the core or kernel of your objection to your client's treatment is here. Now, is it the AI element? Is it the idea that pro-Palestinian speech is being criminalized? If it is those things, I'm a little confused as to why you're not more crystal clear in saying the accusation of linkage to this group is wrong. Is it false?
We've been crystal clear. Oh, yeah. Just to clarify, we've been crystal clear about that. Once again, I would ask you to go back onto the statement that Dr. Dutegui and I both made on social media yesterday. I think if I were to walk you through, I'll answer the question that you posed initially about what's the core of the issue here. Yes, as we've already touched on, it's the issue of the suppression of only one type of speech. There's no attacks on right-wing pro-Israeli speech or pro-Trump speech. But this event on last Wednesday, I was retained to give you a sense of the massive violation of due process that took place here that should shock everybody. I was retained at about 11:30 in the morning. A couple of hours later, I received an email from Yale insisting that my client submit to an interview with an outside counsel who lists as his services weapons manufacturers and the government of Israel. We responded by attempting to set up a brief interview with the outside counsel. We had a quick conversation early in the, or late in the afternoon, I should say. And I was told that we should put our concerns about the procedural issues in writing. I wrote an email very quickly trying to explain that because Dr. Dutegui was fasting for Ramadan, she just wanted to get a little bit of sleep. You also have to keep in mind, she had been doxxed, she had been subject to really vile abuse by right-wing trolls, and she was not really given a fair opportunity to respond during the day that day. So when the university then, instead of waiting for our email communicating that, said that she was being placed immediately on paid administrative leave for failing to respond, this was a total railroading and a witch hunt. I think, just because I understand the sort of point you're making, and I wasn't just joking around when I raised, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Dr. Dutegui has not been accused of committing any crime. She's been admitted to the United States repeatedly. She has been loud and clear about her pro-Palestinian, anti-imperialist speech. She was clear about that with Yale Law School when they hired her in October 2023. And we do not feel, as a matter of principle, that it's appropriate to put her in the position where she suddenly has to justify potential meetings she's attended. Those were the exact types of questions that were asked by HUAC. In 1937, did you attend a meeting of the National Student Association? Did you donate for refugee assistance for Spain? Were you aware that your wife had attended such meetings? If we're going to stop the attack on democracy and the march toward dictatorship in this country, it means taking a very principled position that we're not going to tolerate being intimidated like that we're going to fight against attacks to suppress pro-Palestinian, socialist, and left-wing speech. And if you want more on that, she's written about a 4-page explanation of the situation, which I would very respectfully suggest that you go and read again.
There is a clause related to visas that indicates they are a privilege, not a right, and you are not allowed to support terror while you are in the U.S. on a visa. The Sammy Dune website identifies your client as a member of the international network. She has described October 7th as an act of Palestinians reclaiming their land and seeking liberation, and has also—
Wait a second, is that a problem? To talk about Palestinians fighting back against the Israeli government? Are you saying that that constitutes terrorism?
October 7th was an act of terrorism, yes, absolutely. And so I think it's entirely reasonable for those questions to be raised in regards to your client's status in the United States. She's welcome to appeal that, and the government then has to prove through clear and convincing evidence that she did engage in activities supporting terrorism. But to suggest that this is merely a speech issue, your client's not a citizen of the United States, so these are all legitimate questions.
Let me ask you, does the First Amendment say the rights of citizens, or does it say the rights of the people?
Legally, through the visa process, they agree to
why
not
don't you answer
support
that
terror,
question?
right?
Oh, sorry, yes, certainly. However, why don't you answer the question about whether the First Amendment applies to non-citizens in the United States?
Does the First Amendment allow a visa holder to support terrorism?
The First Amendment allows individuals who are in the United States, regardless of their alienage, regardless of their citizenship status, to criticize the U.S. government, to criticize its policies, to criticize the government of a foreign state, i.e. Israel, to claim, as you seem to be by parroting the line of Marco Rubio and also of Yale University, to be honest, that any comments about the political situation there that don't toe the line of the U.S. government and the corporate media establishment, of which many institutions are a part, we reject entirely the notion and the lie and the pretext. And I'll make another point about this, since you keep raising it. The attempt to throw the word terrorism around has been a bipartisan affair since actually really before September 11th, but both parties have been collaborating to raise the boogeyman of terrorism, to present national security as a justification for illegalizing broad swaths of speech. And if you want to talk about what the Israeli government has done to the population of the Gaza Strip, I would call that terrorism. So we reject, again, I'll just say it for the third time here, the government of the United States, the Trump administration do not have the right, and we will vociferously oppose all attempts to draw an equal sign or conflate speech that is engaged in by people who are here lawfully and to whom the First Amendment applies. I'll answer the question for you. It says the rights of the people shall be protected. And so that's our position, and we'll be fighting for this position very, very loudly and very forcefully in the coming days and weeks. And we urge everybody who's watching to really draw the conclusions about the present situation. Trump is talking about invoking the Alien Enemies Act so that he can go out and grab people like the Gestapo-like raid that took place in eastern Washington earlier this week, where ICE agents broke through the windows and harassed a pregnant woman and assaulted them, an entire family, dragging them apart. They're sending people to Guantanamo Bay and shackling them in chains. And so we would urge everybody out there who wants to stand up to defend democracy and to oppose the entire political establishment that tries to treat, as unfortunately you have done, speech in support of the people of Palestine as terrorism.
Eric Lee, a spirited discussion, which we like here on Rising, and we appreciate you having it with us. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Up next, the left tries to break into the podcast world. Is that working? We'll discuss.
If imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, then Joe Rogan, Tucker Carlson, and Theo Vaughn must be absolutely beaming.
Democrats are taking a crack at the podcast game. On the one hand, you have California Governor Gavin Newsom.
So far, Newsom has had 3 right-wing powerhouse guests: Turning Point USA founder Charlie Kirk, War Room host Steve Bannon, and political commentator Michael Savage. Newsom has been able to surpass 1 million views within these 3 episodes, and has even split with Democrats on certain issues in the process.
Here's a clip.
And like crushed. And you have an opportunity in the state to be like, look, I have a heart for A.B. Hernandez. I have a heart for the San Jose volleyball player. Let's give them compassion. What's not fair is just for like entire woman's sports.
I agree. By the way, I agree with you. The issue of fairness is completely legit. So I completely align with you. And we've got to own that. We've got to acknowledge it. The Latinx stuff, by the way, not one person ever in my office has ever used the word Latinx.
So can we finally put that to bed?
Yeah,
we agree?
but where did that even go?
No more Latinx, everybody.
Well, I just didn't even know where it came from. I'm like, what are people talking about?
Some on the left are blasting Newsom for these heresies and for having right-wing guests. Here's former Congressman Adam Kinzinger this week.
I see that Gavin Newsom has decided to invite Steve Bannon on his podcast, and they're going to have just a wonderful conversation. Bannon is the author of this chaos we're seeing right now. Bannon is the one that says you need to flood the zone with Bannon is the one that has basically authored where we are and what Donald Trump wants. And because Gavin Newsom wants to run for president and thinks he's going to be this healer, he brings on this nationalist. Many of us on the right sacrificed our careers taking these people on, and Newsom's trying to make a career with them. This is insane.
Separate from all that, there's former First Lady Michelle Obama. She launched her new podcast titled IMO this week. She's done 2 full podcasts, one with her brother, who's a co-host, and another with actress Issa Rae.
She's uploaded 5 videos in total so far, but has yet to surpass 1 million views. Here's one clip that has gone viral.
Well, Barack, he had to adjust to what on time was for me.
Because he was on that island time.
Well, but, I've got this husband who's like, when it's time to leave, it's 3 o'clock, he's getting up and going to the bathroom. And I was like, dude, like 3 o'clock departure means you've done all that, It's like, don't start looking for your glasses, at the 3 o'clock departure. But he's improved over 30 years of marriage. But that was you must adjust.
Of course, some on the right have ripped the First Lady for her relatively low numbers and content. Political commentator Benny Johnson wrote on X, Michelle Obama's first couple of podcast episodes absolutely flopped, not even getting a combined 20,000 views in the 15 hours after posting. What an utter failure. Who thought this was a good idea?
So much to get to here, Amber.
Indeed.
First of all, I'm reminded of the dangers of ad-libbing in the script, because I said that Newsom was being criticised by people on the left, not knowing we were introducing a clip of Adam Kinzinger, who is not on the left by any
not
realistic
on the right
version. No, exactly. He's somewhere in the middle ground there. So look, 2 things. Firstly, I think that Gavin Newsom is in fact to be applauded by talking to people who fervently disagree with him. You could argue about who exactly he should or shouldn't be speaking with. I'm not particularly, as a viewer, avidly interested in what Charlie Kirk has to say, but if he wants to have those discussions, I think that's a good thing. I think there is far too much political discourse right now that is purely people talking to others with whom they agree. So fair enough, and fair enough if those discussions lead to a more questioning approach to certain things that have become kind of democratic or liberal shibboleths.
Yeah, I'm fine with Gavin Newsom having a podcast so long as it doesn't distract him from running the state of California. That could be problematic when it comes time for him to do his inevitable presidential run in 2028. But I read this X post from communications consultant Lulu Chang that I thought was really interesting, which is that Newsom has not only invited these right-wing guests on, but he's kept the conversation civil and even warm, and will gradually distance himself from the woke excesses of the past. And now he'll have several years to hone his arguments, practice debating, and explain away political liabilities like his COVID school closures, which I think is an interesting way of looking at it. This is effectively practice for him when he has to distance himself from some of the policies of California that are considered too liberal for the rest of the country, or of the Democratic Party writ large that have largely been culturally out of fashion since the past election. So in that sense, it's kind of wise.
Yeah, but are you implying that that is... I mean, I don't see anything nefarious about that. I mean, if he wants to practice for a presidential run, I think that's fine. Okay.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's actually a smart strategy.
No, and I think it's a smart strategy not only in terms of the issue of practice that you mentioned, but in terms of this attempt to try to create or at least engage with new methods of communication. And so there has, as you're well aware, been this whole debate because Joe Rogan, having been at one stage a Bernie Sanders supporter, has certainly, I think, drifted fairly significantly to the right. And we see other people in the conservative space getting very high numbers for podcasts that are plainly right-leaning, if not, fervently so. And so I think that there is an attempt on Newsom's part to try to create that kind of space. I think that's a good thing. We had a debate actually earlier on this week on Rising about California, which I think there's a whole other debate to be had there where I think that it is used as a kind of emblem of democratic malfeasance in a way that I don't actually think is particularly fair, but that will be, of course, leveled against Newsom, and he'll have a chance to defend himself.
I think one of the big problems with the Democrats' shift to podcasting is that they are not really understanding the underlying reasons why these right-coded podcasts do so well.
Which is what, in your opinion?
Well, if you're looking at people like Joe Rogan and Theo Von or the Nelk Boys or Full Send podcast, these things are not inherently political. They might have a political bent, they might have political guests, and certainly talk about political issues, but these are not people who are part of a party apparatus. They're not people who have views that are easily pigeonholed into one particular ideology. I mean, if you listen to Theo Von interview Bernie Sanders and talk about healthcare, and then interview Trump and talk about culture, like this could be two different people, but it's sort of this left-right populist crossover phenomenon that's been happening with people like Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., and again, Joe Rogan. So when the Democrats are saying, okay, we're going to have our own podcasting apparatus, and we're going to have Gavin Newsom, Michelle Obama, the Pod Save America guys who all worked for the Obama administration, we're going to have Hassan Piker and these other really dyed-in-the-wool left-wing activists, they're kind of missing the magic of why people are so attracted to the right-coded podcast or the bro podcast, which is that these people are not politicians, they're not people who have campaign experience, they're not people who worked for the DNC, they're actually real people who just have political opinions that are not easily compartmentalized into one box or ideology.
I'm just thinking through that, as you said, and I think that is a pretty fair point. I can't think instantly of somebody who is a very big new media figure who's just a man or woman who happens to lean liberal. And I mean, could you say that about the woman who Kamala Harris did the podcast with in the campaign?
Alex Cooper.
I mean, I think, is she not liberal leaning by her nature?
I'm sure she is. I guess the difference is that her podcast has been geared towards celebrity and pop culture, and the only political interview she did was Kamala Harris, whereas these other people sort of dabble in politics on a regular basis. So that seems more inauthentic because it was so outside of the scope of what the show usually does.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I am not somebody who's necessarily like a hater of Joe Rogan, for example. Now, I don't also listen to his 3-hour episodes every time, but I do take the point that there is a conversational tone to it. I do wonder if, to your point, I mean, it seems to me when I hear Rogan or see clips of him that he is moving increasingly into alignment with the current Republican Party. And I wonder if there's at any point where that does begin to impede the kind of thing that you're talking about, which is a more organic appeal. Certainly, from what it's worth, I think he's increasingly kind of groveling toward Elon Musk, which, doesn't appeal to me very much, but we'll see if it has any detrimental impact on him. As far as, let me just put in a pro-Michelle Obama note at the end, because I do think that she is a very appealing figure to a lot of people. Obviously, conservatives dislike her because she's not conservative. But if you look at something like her first memoir, Becoming, that had massive sales. She did a whole arena tour for it. Different things that people do have different levels of appeal. There was a follow-up, well, not really a follow-up. There was a second book, which was not a memoir, it was more sort of good feelings book that didn't do so well, and the podcast with her brother hasn't drawn enormous audiences. But I do think that she is someone who does have broader appeal, even though very obviously being a very firm Democrat.
Yeah, I think time will tell whether this is just different venue, different method, different level of support, or is the Obama's influence on the Democratic Party waning a bit after the Biden coup, and that remains to be seen.
See, Amber, we were having such a nice discussion, and now you start talking about Biden coups and whatnot. Which was,
Biden replacement.
It was a perfectly legitimate party repairing or replacing somebody who was too old to be president.
Well, all right.
As they were entitled to do.
They're welcome to do it, but we don't have to like it. That does it for us today on Rising. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.